Welcome back then folks to the second build of Special Projects pack number 20 of course, and this one I alluded to earlier on today, a build to turn the Ferrari Enzo into a kind of stand-in, or at least the closest we can do really, to the massively popular Ferrari FXX. Now typically, those of you who follow this series closely will know that I don't like to do, really, builds like this. I prefer ones which are much closer to the car that you're trying to do, especially visually speaking, and to me this one, it's not really that close. At a passing glance, you can suddenly think, oh wait, is there an FXX in the game? But as soon as you give it any kind of decent look, you're like, oh no, that's just an Enzo with a wing and some paint. And I don't usually like to do ones like this, but for this one I really wanted to do an Enzo build. I was originally planning to do the Gambala, the MiG U1, but again, the problem is the visuals are just not even close. And then I spotted this particular design a player had done. I like the fact that it's in blue, which again hides some of the details, kind of like a black and white version does. The red, you immediately recognise what's not right about it, whereas when it's in a different colour, I personally find it allows it to be a bit more passable. And again, it's never going to pass for an actual FXX, but for those of us who are super fans of that car, and it really was one of the most OP cars in Gran Turismo 6, for example, it's something, at least. It's closer, and thankfully the specs aren't too far off at all. Now, as far as the actual build, of course, you'll need to get one of these in the first place, which in my case took 3 years to finally have the invitation, so you better believe I bought like 2 of everything when I got those Ferrari invites. So as far as the build, if we jump to the Ultimate section, we do have the high lift S cams, but we do not have the Stage 5 weight. Simply put, because you don't need it. The actual FXX, or the specs of the FXX that we're using, are with GT6 as the reference. So 789 horsepower, I think that one was, 788 in the case of this one, and 1155 kilos. So doing the Stage 5, the only real advantage, and you could view this as an advantage if you wanted to, is you could get it to a different weight split, if you will, by positioning the ballast differently, but I didn't want to go too far on that. And I especially didn't want to waste, as I accidentally hit out of the menu, I didn't want to waste an Enzo by going too far on the weight, which was one of the issues I had before when I was building the Art Morrison Corvette replica. And of course you can reset the car, but again, just wasting cash for no reason. So, to jump back to the Ultimate stuff, we do have the high lift S cams, like I said. You want your Stage 1 weight, of course, sports hard tyres are already fitted. The high lift cams are naturally fitted anyway when you fit the S version. The bored out engine, which of course is appropriate. It's a shame that you can't make it even bigger than that with like a stroker kit on it as well, because of course the FXX does have a bigger engine. It's a 6.3 if I recall correctly instead of a 6 litre, so that is appropriate. As far as the rest here in the Club Sports section, you don't actually need the power restrictor, but you do want the ballast, only for 1 kilo, spoiler alert. As far as the semi-racing stuff, the ECU, the limited slip diff, and the, well, there's nothing else there actually, but I was going to say the body rigidity is something which you could consider. It does seem like something that would be appropriate for the car, but it does lower the points. So I'll leave that up to you. And again, it's an expensive car to reset if you find that you don't want it after the fact. So as far as the racing stuff, of course, you didn't need a huge amount of power adjustment to get the standard roughly like 650 horsepower car up to about 789 in the case of the racing version, or the FXX version, in other words. But the racing silencer for me is essential. It has to sound the part, and in the case of many cars, look the part. With this one, it doesn't really change the exhaust that much. It certainly doesn't put the exhaust to where the lights used to be, which is what the Enzo's got. The racing brake pads, of course, the suspension, the clutch and flywheel, of course, the fully customised transmission as well. I've gone for racing hards. You could make the argument of making it even more OP and just slapping softs on there, but I wanted to keep it, you know, semi-grounded. And in terms of the point level, of course, that does make a bigger difference, up around 20 or so points higher, but it's still, to be fair, well below 800. So the Hypercar Parade, for example, you could use it for probably. The carbon ceramics, any who noticed that I didn't fit the racing brakes will immediately know why. That is, of course, because I fitted those. And, of course, we already visited the Ultimate section. So, for something with nearly 800 horsepower that weighs basically GT1 car territory, that's not a bad point level. And it is still on racing tyres. So to be 764, Well, like I said, not only can you take it into the hypercar parade, that's just not really a crazy point level in general for something with those kind of numbers. So that bodes pretty well in terms of being able to use it at least. So we've got the racing hards, of course, fitted. For the suspension, it sounds crazy high at 120mm on the rear, but if you look, of course, it really isn't. In fact, those wheels barely fit inside the arches at that level. So we've got 90mm on the front, 120 on the rear, 6 on the anti-roll, so fairly hefty on that by my usual standards, 40 all round for the dampers, 4 on the springs, so again very, very high on that one. Surprisingly, given how stiff the springs and everything are, not too much camber, only 1 degree. And then for the toe, we've got toe in 0.10 and also toe in on the front to help with the turn in and make it sharper into corners as well. As far as the diff, I personally really like the lowest for the initial torque on this one, and then maxed out both the acceleration and the braking, or the deceleration if you will. Give that a try, see what you think. I personally really like that. I definitely erred on the side of it being heavier through corners because I didn't want the car to be super twitchy and slippery and kind of inconsistent. I wanted it to be a bit on the heavier side because then you know exactly what it's going to do every single corner and you can plan for that and use it to your advantage. So that is, spoiler alert, what I went for. As far as the transmission, 350 kilometers an hour. Of course, it's not a top-end car, but again, even around Monza, as you'll see fairly soon, you can get it to up around 220 miles an hour pretty easily. So the gearbox is more than good enough in my opinion. Like I said earlier on, 1 kilo of ballast just to bring us up to 1155. I guess it doesn't really matter where you put that kilo because it's not like it's going to make much of a difference. The ECU, of course, and the power restrictor are untouched. For the downforce, you cannot adjust the front. Thankfully, it already has a decent amount. And because of that, I opted to go just straight down the middle for the rear because I'm assuming that 200 on the front is probably roughly the equivalent of somewhere around the middle, so I wanted to keep it fairly even. If you do want to go higher or lower, of course that's up to you, and that will again make a difference, of course, to your point level. So if you lower it on the rear, you'll have a significant bump up in points, and vice versa. If you give it more downforce on the back, well, of course it will change your handling, but it will give you a point advantage as well. And over here, what relatively few things we did fit, you can see. So all that remains, as always, is to jump out on the track. And as I said, that track in question is Monza. Now, one additional thing which I forgot to mention just now, and the keen eye might have noticed this, is that the one change I made to this particular player's livery is they had fitted the tow rope or the tow hitch to the car. So if you do notice that difference when you fit yours, that'll be the reason why. Now, as far as how it actually performs, I already spoiled the fact that it is a bit on the heavier side, of course, by design, that's the whole point. And on most circuits, I feel like you're not going to really notice that as much as you do on tracks like High Speed Ring or here, because when you've got a long sweeping turn, that is when the understeer will come in more, and that leans into my advice on using the car. Because by far my biggest key piece of advice with this one is brake while the car is going in a straight line, because this car does not like turning and braking. I have noticed that a number of cars have become a lot more sensitive to that. I think some of the physics changes have made that more realistic, where before, and of course much more in older games, you could brake midway through a corner if you wanted to and you'd still probably be okay, whereas now it's a lot less forgiving. You do have to try and brake, if at all possible, when the car is going in a straight line, as you would, in other words, in real life, at least for the majority of the time. And any who have taken a car in real life to high speed, you will of course be familiar with locking up, because a lot of cars, even with ABS, will not like the idea of braking and turning at the same time. So that is pretty realistic. So that is my biggest bit of advice. Listen to the braking flashing indicator. It is your best friend when it comes to this car, especially because you build up performance so quickly, and then as long as you do brake while you're still going straight, you can throw it into the corner, especially with that hint of understeer on corner entry, and it will just coast its way through, power on out. And if you do treat it with respect, it is a very rewarding, very fun car. It sounds fantastic, it looks pretty damn nice as well, about as close, as I said, to what an FXX is going to look like when it's not built on an actual one. And for those curious about lap times, this one actually compares very well to some of my other builds. In fact, I would say it compares quite appropriately, because this is faster than one of my favourite ones ever, the Lamborghini RGT. This is quicker than that, as it should be, but, and this I also find quite accurate, this is a little bit slower than my own F8XX, which I think is actually pretty much perfect, because that car had a lot more power. That was like a, what, 850 horsepower car, if I recall correctly, also a newer platform as well. So that sounds kind of perfect to me. That's exactly where this car should be. If then you are a massive fan of the FXX, as I know so many players are, it is a very curious vehicle to not have in the game, especially when the FXXK is not even close to how useful that car was. Then I hope of course you have some enjoyment with this one. Maybe you've got an Enzo lying around. I feel like for most players, probably not. But of course, give it a try. Hope you enjoy it. Check out the Corvette from earlier on today, and of course the 8 remaining builds coming up this week. But for now, thanks for watching.